Today is by Julia Ward Howe. It's called Mother's Day Proclamation. Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether your baptism be that of water or of fears. Say firmly, we will not have great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We women of one country will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence indicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as the means whereby the great human family can live in peace, and each bearing after her own time the sacred impress, not of Caesar, but of God.
If your entire conception of American motherhood came from commercials, you'd think that everybody's mom was sweet and loving and hardworking and perfect. Not to mention white and thin and pretty and middle class and between 30 and 45 years old. Even today, in 2013, most of the moms in those commercials look like modern day counterparts of their 1950s versions. They're taking care of their children, fawning over their husbands, folding laundry, doing housework. Even the ones with a little bit more backstory in those 30-second commercial spots, the ones pictured coming in the front door and they sent down a briefcase by the front door as they come in, what's the first thing they do? Let me tell you, it is not pouring themselves a stiff drink or vegging out on the couch while hubby dearest makes the dinner. Nope, in these commercials, they go right back to those traditional motherly duties. Scrambling to get dinner on the table or rushing to get the kids to soccer practice. The portrayal of motherhood in advertising gets even less complex and more infuriating as we start inching towards May and Mother's Day. Hallmark and 1-800-Flowers play on all of those tropes of motherhood that they know are so deeply ingrained in us. They say to us, remember all those hours that mom spent vacuuming and scrubbing and polishing? All the rehearsals and games she drove you to? And how she still had time to cook and look perfect 24/7? You remember that? Well, then show your deepest appreciation for mom by buying her trite, overpriced gifts. If you couldn't tell, I have a few things to say about the portrayals of moms in the media. Really, it's a lifelong critique that I came by pretty honestly. For a little bit of context, one of the first pictures of me, when I'm probably not more than about 4 or 5 months old, is in the summer of 1982, and it's of me and my mom in the sunshine on a grassy lawn. My mom is young, younger than I am now, and she's sitting on the ground, beautiful and tan, and rocking this fabulous 80s hairdo and sunglasses. She grins, and I grin. I'm tiny and chubby, and I'm sort of wobbling on my legs and hanging onto her fingers. And behind us, you can see a crowd of people, some of whom you can vaguely make out holding signs and banners. And I am proudly wearing a light green t-shirt that says, "The ERA is for my future." Now, if you don't remember, some of us perhaps are of a generation where this was not part of our consciousness, but the ERA was the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution, proposed to guarantee equal protection and rights to women. And it failed to get the requisite number of votes during its more than 50-year history of being proposed. And so it ultimately died in June of 1982. But that was the context into which I was born. Second wave feminism was in full swing. My own parents were self-identified feminists. My mom was beautiful and hardworking, like the moms on those commercials. But she was also the poster child of what I hear we used to call it women's lib. She graduated summa cum laude from college. She went on to edit the law review at USC while getting her law degree. She and my dad negotiated their careers together. And my mom has always been the major breadwinner in my family. And she became an extremely successful corporate lawyer and smashed through glass ceiling after glass ceiling. My dad, for his part, was in freelance film and video, making less money, but keeping a much more flexible schedule that allowed him to spend lots of time with me and my brother. For the most part, he handled those domestic duties that were traditionally assigned to moms, from cooking to shopping to staying home with us while we were sick. So with this as the context to my upbringing, and with my parents' intentional and explicit messages that traditional gender roles were worthy of critique, if not outright rejection, it's not a wonder that I am not a big fan of the moms, those one-dimensional moms portrayed in advertising media. My own life experience tells me that mother-child relationships are full of so much more than what we see during those commercial breaks. Full of love and disappointment and frustration and misunderstanding and forgiveness and support and pride and 1,000 other things. And my life experience also tells me that anything that distills women down to a single role diminishes the complexity and the humanity of all of us. The struggle against the patriarchal tendency to box women in, both literally and figuratively, that's the crux of feminism. And it is a struggle that many, many women throughout history have undertaken. This morning, a few minutes ago, you heard Sylvia read the words of Julia Ward Howe. She's one of my personal inspirations as a woman, as a mother, as an activist, and as a Unitarian. Julia Ward Howe was born in 1819 in New York City. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, who was a very wealthy Wall Street banker, was left in charge of the children. Young Julia had an insatiable appetite for learning. And by the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in 5 languages and had become a serious student of literature and philosophy. But she wasn't just a brain. Her father was a strict Calvinist and fiercely protective of the children, but he still allowed them to participate in the New York social scene, where they rubbed elbows with the high society crowd on a regular basis. After her father died when Julia was 29 years old, as she was grieving, a relative sent her a printed sermon from the famous Unitarian preacher William Ellery Channing, which she found both comforting and enlightening. When she visited Boston the next year, she attended discussion groups and lectures with the likes of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret Fuller. And that exposed her for the first time to liberal religion. Later, she wrote in her journal, "I studied my way out of all of the mental agonies which Calvinism can engender, and I became a Unitarian." While she was in Boston, she went on a visit with her friends Charles Sumner and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. If you read her biography, there's like 1,000 names of people who are famous from this era. She knew them all. But so, chumming around with old Longfellow and Charles Sumner, they went to the New England Institute for the Blind, where they introduced her to a man named Samuel Gridley Howe. He was impressive and dashing. He was almost 20 years older than Julia, and he was a hero of the Greek War for independence, and he was also a groundbreaking educator who pioneered the field of education for students with mental and physical disabilities in this country. He had been dubbed for his military service Chevalier of the Order of Saint Savior, and Julia took to calling him Chev for short. They were married after a whirlwind courtship. But it turns out that marriage came as a bit of a shock to Julia. She had always been curious and brilliant and self-motivated, running in elite circles of intellectuals and socialites. But her new husband wanted a very traditional wife and mother, more in line with the feminine ideals of the day. So he discouraged her writing, and he moved her away from the city proper to isolated South Boston, which at that point was nearly an hour's commute outside of the city. While she was there, she gave birth to 3 children in the first 5 years of their marriage, and she was only able to escape the confines of her life on Sunday morning when they went to church at Theodore Parker's congregation in Boston. Chev took control of her sizable inheritance and gave her only a limited allowance, thereby cutting her off and limiting her freedom. This remained an issue for the rest of their marriage. Their relationship was tumultuous, and they even separated for a year, with Julia taking 2 of their children with her to Rome. But eventually she returned to Boston and to her husband. She was never one to lie down and surrender, though, and so in 1854, after 11 years of marriage and 5 children at this point, Julia had a collection of poetry published anonymously, although soon it became widely known that she was the author. Chev was furious. Not only had he forbidden her from writing or publishing, her poems were a scathing critique of an autocratic husband who was unfaithful, speaking openly about the despair and constraint that Julia experienced in their marriage. Their relationship remained rocky, but Julia knew that he would take away her children if they divorced, and of course at that point women had no recourse for such things. They stayed together until Chev's death in 1876, 33 long years after they were married. In the intervening years, though, the couple gradually learned to give each other the latitude and to live and let live. Both were fierce abolitionists, and Chev was part of the Secret Six that funded the John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He became a part of the Sanitation Commission during the Civil War, caring for Union soldiers who had been wounded or disabled in the war. For her part, Julia continued to publish her poetry, including what is perhaps her most famous poem, the Battle Hymn of the Republic. She also published plays and literary criticism and edited several journals. After the war, she became a leader in the women's suffrage movement, founding the New England Women's Club and the American Women's Suffrage Association. She also pursued her literary and theological interests, creating salon-like circles with the best and brightest intellectuals and religious scholars of her day. And then, later, after having witnessed both the Civil War and then the Franco-Prussian War, Julia became most deeply invested in the peace movement. Our reading today was the kickoff speech for what she envisioned as a women's crusade for peace. And you might notice, as she kicked off this first Mother's Day, it doesn't resemble what you find on the Hallmark cards today. But what I love most about that piece, about the Mother's Day Declaration, is that it speaks with a voice of integrity in the literal sense, integration of the identities of mother and activist and woman and citizen, refusing to either remain shackled by the confines of traditional gender roles or to reject the fulfilling, beautiful parts inherent in those roles of wife and mother and woman. We live today in a postmodern society in which those traditional understandings of femininity, of family, and parenthood have been multiplied and expanded and exploded to the point that Julia Ward Howe or her 19th century counterparts would hardly recognize them. And yet, in spite of all of that incredible diversity that is implied when we use the word mother or woman, the figures portrayed in those 30-second commercial snapshots aren't all that different than the one Chev Howe wanted so desperately for his wife to embody back in the middle of the 19th century. I think that if Julia Ward Howe were living today, she would be a part of a different kind of crusade, one that brought people together across lines of race and class and nationality and gender and family structure to advocate for a society in which all people, all families, are valued and empowered, in which we understand that militarism and patriarchy are bad not just for women, but for every person, in which we acknowledge that every person holds multiple identities and that we should celebrate those differences, that richness, rather than trying to limit ourselves and argue across lines of difference. This Mother's Day, next week, our national Standing on the Side of Love campaign from the Unitarian Universalist Association is partnering with an organization called Strong Families that is trying to do just this. Strong Families describes themselves as a home for the 4 out of 5 people living in the U.S. who do not live behind the picket fence, whose lives fall outside outdated notions of family, with a mom at home and a dad at work. While that life has never been a reality for most of our families, too many of the policies that affect us are based on that fantasy. From a lack of affordable childcare and after-school programs, to immigration policy, to marriage equality, the way we make policy and allocate resources needs to catch up with the way we live. She goes on to say, the trend of families defining themselves beyond the picket fence across generation, race, gender, immigration status, and sexuality. We see this as a powerful and promising development for the U.S., and we want to help policymakers catch up. Our vision is that every family have the rights, recognition, and resources it needs to thrive. Don't you think old Julia would have been right down there on the front lines with them? I do. So on the Stronger Families website, which I do encourage you to check out, just Google Stronger Families, they have a blog post series called Mama's Day, Our Way. And I want to read you an excerpt from a post by blogger Chanel Matthews. She writes, if Mother's Day is about celebrating motherhood, don't queer moms, immigrant moms, moms of children with disabilities, and moms with disabilities deserve to be celebrated? If Mother's Day emphasizes the importance of the maternal bond, don't genderqueer moms, adoptive moms, foster moms, trans moms, grandmas parenting kids, and single moms also experience the same bond? If the purpose of Mother's Day is to highlight the influence of mothers, aren't stepmoms, incarcerated moms, young moms, refugee moms, low-income moms, and moms living on sovereign land also influential? It's not new news that the greeting card companies aren't in the business of celebrating the marginalized, she says. After all, who wants to read a greeting card that says, Happy Mother's Day, Mom, I'm sorry you got deported? But whether they highlight our stories or not, we exist. Our experiences are real, and as long as policies are in place to dehumanize, shame, and ignore us, holidays like Mother's Day won't accurately illustrate how we move through the world. As happens on most holidays, she says, mothers and those of us who love them are exploited for profit. We're convinced that those with maximum purchase power love our moms the most. And unfortunately, many of us, myself included, internalize that propaganda. So we go to the drugstores, the jewelry stores, the chocolate shops, and we search. We search for something that shows the mamas in our lives how much we love them, how much they're appreciated and needed and wanted. But these things that we're told are important don't hold a candle to what many mamas really need: change. The mothers whose lives are not being reflected on greeting cards are in need of something that can't be delivered, worn, or eaten. They need policies that accurately reflect the reality of their daily lives. They need affordable health care, citizenship, access to healthy foods, transportation, birth control, self-care time, and support. They need second parent adoptions without all the red tape. They need safe spaces from domestic abusers, visitation rights, affordable and safe housing, and culturally relevant education in languages that their families understand. They need less shaming and more policies in places that make it safe and secure to be the kind of moms they want to be. I say amen to that, Chanel Matthews. And so on this Mother's Day, my message to all of us is very simple. Let us celebrate our mothers, and not just the ones who manage to live up to the impossible caricature of motherhood we see on TV. Let us celebrate the women who birthed us, seeing them as whole and complex human beings for whom the word mom is only one descriptor of their identity. Let us celebrate the women who took us in and gave us wisdom or shelter or love when our own mothers were unable to do so. Let us celebrate people of all genders who mother young people, creating families that are not yet seen and recognized by our society. And let us celebrate our mothers not with expensive gifts and cheap sentimentality, but by working together to build a world in which peace prevails, at home, in the streets, and in our hearts. So arise, people of this day, and let us make it so. Blessed be, Ashe, and Amen. Our closing hymn this morning is